Today is March 26th, 2024, and my guest is Teppo Felin, the Douglas D. Anderson Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Huntsman School of Business at Utah State University. He's also an associate scholar at Oxford University. This is Teppo's second appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in July of 2018 to discuss rationality. We have an even broader topic today, thinking. What is it? What does it mean for human beings to think? Are we about to be surpassed by artificial thinking? Many people think so, but not Teppo, as far as I understand him. Teppo, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks for having me, Russ.
We're going to base our conversation today loosely on a recent article you wrote, Theory is All You Need, AI, Human Cognition and Decision-Making, co-written with Matthias Holwig of Oxford. Now, you write in the beginning, the abstract of the paper, that many people believe, quote, due to human bias and bounded rationality, humans should or will soon be replaced by AI in situations involving high-level cognition and strategic decision-making, end quote. You disagree with that pretty clearly. And I want to start to get at that. I want to start with a seemingly strange question. Is the brain a computer? If it is, we're in trouble. So I know the answer is it's not quite or not at all. So how do you understand the brain?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think the computer's been a pervasive metaphor since the 1950s, from kind of the onset of artificial intelligence. So in the 1950s, there's this famous kind of inaugural meeting of the kind of pioneers of AI, Herbert Simon and I think Minsky and Newell and many others were involved. But basically, in their proposal for that meeting, and I think it was 1956, they said, we want to understand how computers think, or how the human mind thinks, and they think how the human mind thinks. And they argued that this could be replicated by computers, essentially. And now, sort of 50, 60 years subsequently, we essentially have all kinds of models that build on this computational model. So evolutionary psychology by Cosmides and Tooby, predicted processing by people like Friston, and certainly the neural networks and connectionist models are all essentially trying to do that. They're trying to model the brain as a computer, and I'm not sure that it is. And I think we'll get at those issues. I think there's aspects of this that are absolutely brilliant and insightful, and what large language models and other forms of AI are doing are remarkable. I use all of these tools. But I'm not sure that we're actually modeling the human brain necessarily. I think something else is going on, and that's kind of what the paper is with Matthias is getting at. So,
I always find it interesting that human beings, in our pitiful command of the world around us, often through human history, take the most advanced device that we can create and assume that the brain is like that until we create a better device. Now, it's possible, I don't know anything about quantum computing, but it's possible that we will create different computing devices that will become the new metaphor for what the human brain is. And, fundamentally, I think the attraction of this analogy is that, well, the brain has electricity in it, and it has neurons that switch on and off, and therefore it's something like a giant computing machine. What's clear to you, and what I learned from your paper, and I think is utterly fascinating, is that what we call thinking as human beings is not the same as what we have programmed computers to do with at least large language models. And that forces us, which I think is beautiful, think about what it is that we actually do when we do what we call thinking. There are things we do that are a lot like large language models, in which case it is a somewhat useful analogy, but it's also clear to you, I think, and now to me, that is not the same thing. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, the whole what's happening in AI has had me and us kind of wrestling with what it is that the mind does. I mean, this is an area that I've focused on my whole career, cognition and rationality and things like that. But Matthias and I were teaching an AI class and kind of wrestling with this in terms of differences between humans and computers. And if you take something like a large language model, I mean, how it's trained is it's remarkable. And so you have a large language model. My understanding is that the most recent ones have something, they're kind of pre-trained with something like 13 trillion words, or they're called tokens, which is a tremendous amount of text, right? So this is scraped from the internet. It's the works of Shakespeare, and it's Wikipedia, and it's Reddit, and it's all kinds of things, right? And if you think about what the inputs of human pre-training are, it's not 13 trillion words, right? I mean, these large language models get this training within weeks or months, and a human, and we have sort of a back of the envelope calculation looking at some of the literature with infants and children, but they encounter maybe, I don't know, 15, 17,000 words a day through parents speaking to them, or maybe reading or watching TV or media and things like that. And for a human to actually kind of replicate that 13 trillion words, it would be hundreds of years, right? And so we're clearly doing something different. We're not kind of being input. We're not this sort of empty vessel bucket that things get poured into, which is what the large language models are. And then in terms of outputs, it's remarkably different as well. And so you have the model is trained with all of these inputs, 13 trillion, and then it's a stochastic process of kind of drawing or sampling from that to give us fluent text. And that text, I mean, when I saw those first models, it's remarkable. It's fluent. It's good. It's remarkable. It surprised me. But as we kind of wrestled with what it is, it's very good at predicting the next word, right? And so it's good at that. And in terms of kind of the level of knowledge that it's giving us, the way that we try to summarize it is it's kind of Wikipedia level knowledge in some sense. So it could give you indefinite Wikipedia articles, beautifully written about Russ Roberts or about EconTalk or about the Civil War or about Hitler or whatever it is. And so it could give you indefinite articles in sort of combinatorially pulling together text that isn't plagiarized from some existing source, but rather is stochastically drawn from its ability to give you really coherent sentences. But as humans, we're doing something completely different. And of course, our inputs aren't just, they're multimodal. It's not just that, our parents speak to us and we listen to, to radio or TV or what have you. We're also visually seeing things. We're taking things in through different modalities, through people pointing at things and so forth. And in some sense, the data that we get, our pre-training as humans is degenerate in some sense. It's not, if you look at sort of verbal language versus written language, which is carefully crafted and thought out, they're just very different beasts or sort of different entities. And so I think that there's fundamentally something different going on. And I think that analogy sort of holds for a little bit. And it's an analogy that's been around forever. Alan Turing started out with talking about infants and we could train the computer just like we do an infant. But I think it's an analogy that quickly breaks down because there's something else going on. And again, issues that we'll get to. So,
yeah. So I alluded to this, I think, briefly recently. My 20-month-old granddaughter has begun to learn the lyrics to the song "How About You," which is a song written by Burton Lane with lyrics by Ralph Reed. It came out in 1941. So the first line of that song is, I like New York in June. How about you? So I've sung it to my granddaughter probably, 100 times.
Right.
So eventually I leave off the last word. I say, I like New York in June. How about? And she correctly fills in you. It probably isn't exactly you, but it's close enough that I recognize it and I give it a check mark. She will sometimes be able to finish the last three words. I'll say, I like New York in June. She'll go, how about you? How about you? Yeah. Something that sounds vaguely like, how about you?
Right.
Now, I've had kids. I have 4 of them. And I think I sang it to all of them when they were little, including the father of this granddaughter. And they would some say very charmingly when I would say, I like New York in June, and I would say, how about, and they'd fill in, instead of saying you, I'd say, I like New York in June, how about me? Because I'm singing it to them, and they recognize that you is me when I'm pointing at them. And that's a very deep, advanced step.
Absolutely.
But that's about it. They are, as you say, those infants, all infants, are absorbing immense amount of aural, AURAL, material from speaking or radio or TV or screens. They're looking at the world around them, and somehow they're putting it together where eventually they come up with their own requests, frequent, for things that float their boat. And we don't fully understand that process, obviously.
Yeah.
But at the beginning, she is very much like a stochastic process. Actually, it's not stochastic. She's primitive. Mm-hmm. She can't really imagine a different word than you at the end of that sentence other than me.
Sure.
And she would never say, how about chicken? She would say, how about you or me? And that's it. There's no creativity there.
Right.
So on the surface, we are doing as humans, a much more primitive version of what a large language model is able to do. But I think that misses the point, is what I've learned from your paper. It misses the point because that is it's hard to believe. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it doesn't seem to have caught on. It's not the only aspect of what we mean by thinking, is like putting together sentences, which is what a large language model by definition does. And I think as you point out, there's an incredible push to use AI and eventually other presumably models of artificial intelligence than large language models to help us make, quote, rational decisions. So talk about why that's kind of a fool's game, because it seems like a good idea. We've talked recently on the program. It hasn't aired yet, Teppo. You haven't heard it, but we talked. Listeners will have when this airs. We talked recently on the program about biases in large language models, and we're usually talking about by that political biases, ideological biases, things that have been programmed into the algorithms. But when we talk about biases generally with human beings, we're talking about all kinds of struggles that we have as human beings to make, quote, rational decisions. And the idea would be that an algorithm would do a better job, but you disagree. Why?
Yeah, I think we've spent sort of inordinate amounts of kind of journal pages and experiments and time kind of highlighting. In fact, I teach these things to my students, highlighting the ways in which human decision-making goes wrong. And so there's confirmation bias and escalation of commitment. And, I don't know, if you go on the Wikipedia, there's like a list of cognitive biases list there. And I think it's 185 plus. And so it's a long list. But it's still surprising to me. So we've got this long list. And as a result, now there's a number of books that say, because we're so biased, eventually we should just, or not even eventually, like now we should just move to letting algorithms make decisions, for us, basically. And I'm not opposed to that in some situations. I'm guessing that algorithms in some kind of routine settings can be fantastic. They can solve all kinds of problems, and I think those things will happen. But I'm leery of it in the sense that I actually think that biases are not a bug, but they're, to use this trope, they're a feature, right? And so there's many situations in our lives where, we do things that look irrational, but turn out to be rational, right? And so in the paper, we tried to highlight, just to really make this salient and clear, we tried to highlight extreme situations, kind of this. So the one example I'll give you quickly is so if we did this thought experiment of we had a large language model in 1633, and that large language model was input with all the text, scientific text that had been written to that point, right? So it included all the works of Plato and Socrates, and anyway, it had all that work. And those people who were kind of judging the scientific community, Galileo, they said, okay, we've got this great tool that can help us search knowledge. We've got all of knowledge encapsulated in this large language model. So we're going to ask it. We've got this fellow Galileo who's got this crazy idea that the sun is at the center of the universe, and the Earth actually goes around the sun, right?
The solar system.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes. And if you asked it that, it would only parrot back the frequency with which it had in terms of words, the frequency with which it had seen instances of actually the Earth, statements about the Earth being stationary, right, and the sun going around the Earth, and those statements are far more frequent than anybody making statements about a heliocentric sort of view, right? And so it can only pair back what it's most frequently seen in terms of the word structures that it's encountered in the past. And so it has no forward-looking mechanism of anticipating new data and new ways of seeing things. And again, everything that Galileo did looked to be almost an instance of confirmation bias, because I mean, you go outside and our sort of just common conception says, well, you know, Earth is not, it's not clearly not moving. I mean, it turns out it's moving 67,000 miles per hour or whatever it is, roughly in that ballpark. But you sort of verify that, and you could verify that with big data by lots of people going outside and saying, nope, not moving over here, not moving over here. And we could all watch the sun go around, and so kind of common intuition and data would tell us something that actually, you know, isn't true. And so I think that there's something unique and important about having beliefs and having theories. And I think that's, you know, Galileo for me is kind of a microcosm of even our individual lives in terms of how we encounter the world, how things that are in our head structure what becomes salient and visible to us and what becomes important. And so I think that we've oversimplified things by saying, okay, we should just get rid of these biases, because we have instances where yes, biases lead to bad outcomes, but also where things that looked to be biased actually were right in retrospect. And so.
And well, I think, you know, that's a clever example. Sure. And an AI proponent, or to be more disparaging, a hypester, would say that's okay. Yeah, of course, obviously new knowledge has to be produced.
Sure.
And AI hasn't done that yet, but it will, because since it has all the facts, increasingly, and we didn't have very many in Galileo's day. So now we have more, and eventually it will develop its own hypotheses of how the world works. But I think what's clever about your paper and that example is that it gets at something profound and quite deep about how we think and what thinking is. And I think to help us draw that out, let's talk about another example you give, which is the Wright Brothers. So, you know, two seemingly intelligent bicycle repair people in what year? What are we in? 1900, 18?
Yeah. So they started out in 1896 or so. So yeah.
So they say, you know, I think there's never been human flight, but we think it's possible. And obviously, the largest language model of its day, now in 1896, much better. There's much more information than 1633. We know much more about the universe, yeah. But it too would reject the claims of the Wright brothers. And that's not what's interesting. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I like that. But it's more interesting as to why it's going to reject it and why the Wright brothers got it right. Pardon the bad pun. So talk about that and why their ideas took flight.
Yeah, so I kind of like I like the thought experiment of, say I was, so I actually worked in venture capital in the 90s before I got a PhD and, moved into academia. But say the Wright brothers came to me and said they needed some funding for their venture, right? And so I as a data-driven and evidence-based decision maker would say, okay, well, let's look at the evidence. And so, okay, so far, nobody's flown, and there are actually pretty careful records kept about attempts. And so there was a fellow named Otto Lilienthal who was an aviation pioneer in Germany. And what did the data say about him? I think it was in 98, he died attempting flight, right? So that's a data point, and it's a pretty severe one, right? That would tell you that you should probably sort of update your beliefs and say flight isn't possible, right? And so then you might go to the science and say, okay, we've got great scientists like Lord Kelvin, and he's the president of the Royal Society, and we ask him, and he says it's impossible. I've done the analysis; it's impossible. We talked to mathematicians like Simon Newcomb. He's at Johns Hopkins, and he would say, and he actually wrote pretty strong articles saying that this is not possible. This is now an astronomer and a mathematician, one of the top people at the time. And so people might casually point to data that supports the plausibility of this and say, well, look, birds fly. But there's a professor at the time, and UC Berkeley at the time was relatively new, but he was one of the first actually, but his name was Joseph LeConte, and he wrote this article, and it's actually fascinating. He said, okay, I know that people are pointing to birds as the data for why we might fly. And he did this analysis. He said, okay, let's look at birds in flight. And he said, okay, we have little birds that fly and big birds that don't fly. Okay. And then there's somewhere in the middle, and he says, look at turkeys and condors. They barely can get off the ground. And so he said that there's a 50-pound weight limit, basically. And so, and that's the data, right? And so here we have a serious person who became the president of the American Association for Advancement of Science, making this claim that, this isn't possible. And then on the other hand, you have two people who haven't finished high school, bicycle mechanics, who say, well, we're going to ignore this data because we think that it's possible. And it's actually remarkable. I did look at the archive. The Smithsonian has a fantastic resource of just all of their correspondence, the Wright Brothers correspondence with various people across the globe and trying to get data and information and so forth. But they said, okay, we're going to ignore this. And we still have this belief that this is a plausible thing, that human, heavier than air powered flight, as it was called, is possible. But it's not a belief that's kind of just sort of pie in the sky. Like it also, their thinking, getting back to that theme of thinking, involved problem solving. They said, well, what are the problems that we need to solve in order for flight to become a reality? And they kind of winnowed in on three that they felt were critical. And so lift, propulsion, and steering being the central problems that they need to solve in order to enable flight to happen, right? And again, this is going against, really high level arguments by folks in science. And they feel like solving those problems will enable them to create flight. And I think this is, again, it's an extreme case, and it's a story we can tell in retrospect. But I still think that it's a microcosm of what humans do. Is one of our kind of superpowers, but also one of our faults is that we can ignore the data and we can say, no, we think that we can actually create solutions and solve problems in a way that will enable us to create this value. And I'm at a business school, and so I'm extremely interested in this. And how is it that I assess something that's new and novel, that's forward-looking rather than retrospective? And I think that's an area that we need to study and understand rather than just saying, well, beliefs. I don't know. Pinker, in his recent book Rationality, has this great quote: "I don't believe in anything you have to believe in." And so there's this kind of rational mindset that says we don't really need beliefs. What we need is just knowledge. Like, you believe
Just
things
the
because
facts.
that's just the facts, like we just believe things because we have the evidence. But if you use this mechanism to try to understand the Wright brothers, you don't get very far, right? Because they believed in things that were sort of unbelievable at the time, in a sense. But like I said, it wasn't, again, pie in the sky. It was, okay, there's a certain set of problems that we need to solve. And I think that's what humans and life in general, we engage in this problem solving where we figure out what the right data, experiments, and variables are. And I think that happens even in our daily lives. rather than this kind of very rational, okay, here's the evidence, let's array it, and here's what I should believe accordingly. So,
no, I love that because, as you point out, they needed a theory.
Yeah.
They believed in a theory. The theory was not anti-science. It was just not consistent with any data that were available at the time that had been generated, that is within the range of weight, propulsion, lift, and so on. But they had a theory. The theory happened to be correct.
Right.
The data that they had available to them could not be brought to bear on the theory.
Yep.
To the extent it could, it was discouraging, but it was not decisive. And it encouraged them to find other data that didn't exist yet.
Exactly.
And that is the deepest part of this, I think. It's and let me phrase it a different way, and I'd see if you agree with this, because I think it is easy to get lost in the logic of this. At one point in your paper, you talk about a quote from Jan LeCun, the AI person: "Prediction is the essence of intelligence," quote unquote, and that seems reasonable. And usually, to predict something, we have to go back to the past and build a model of causal interaction of variables that we have data on from the past. And then we forecast, that's the prediction part, we forecast the future. And in economics, for example, a lot of people believed, and I think Milton Friedman would be one of them, believe that that's the essence of economics. It's not trying to understand how human beings, say, make decisions as consumers or how those decisions aggregate into a market. We don't need to know that. That'd be nice, but that's not our goal. Our goal is to predict what people are going to do. Right. So what they actually are doing inside the thing called their head, that's a black box. As a social scientist, I don't know what that is. All that really matters is that I can forecast what they're going to do. And if I can forecast, then that's either useful or even illuminating. And what you're suggesting is that is not the only, first of all, that's not the only thing we do, because a lot of times we don't have data on the past to allow us to assess the causal connections that we need to forecast. And that what that really means, as I understand what you're writing, is that forecasting is only one aspect of human cognition. Thinking about how to forecast, that is the underlying models that we use for how the world works, is what allows us to generate the data that allow us to test our theories and models and confirm them, or at least say that the data are consistent with them. But almost by definition, if you have an enormous amount of data, which now is available to human beings through the internet, you have to decide which data to use, because there's a lot of it and it's not all consistent. And even more importantly, and this is what is so cool about the Wright Brothers, sometimes you don't have data yet, even though you have an immense amount of it, that would allow you to assess the correctness of how you think the world works.
No, absolutely. Couple reactions. I mean, there's this article that was written it was in Wired magazine by, I think it was the editor, Anderson, and it was called The End of Theory. And it's sort of subtitled something like Why the Data Deluge Makes Theory Obsolete, basically. And the idea is that, we can run regressions and we can run correlations and associations and things like that. And that's going to tell us the truth, right? But it's precisely the theory that tells us which data to look at, and not only how, which data to look at, but how to interpret that data, right? And so, the Joseph LeConte, for example, was looking at birds. So were actually the Wright brothers, but they were looking at birds differently, right? And so the key variable that Joseph LeConte focused on was the weight of birds. What the Wright brothers, and they did very careful studies of this, they actually looked at sort of wing shape and looked at how they flew, and it was a completely different, different focus for them, because they were interested in, again, solving those three problems that I mentioned earlier: lift and steering and control. And so the key point is that that's something that computers can't do. They take existing data as a given, whereas we as human beings, find and create through experiments new data. And I guess the important point I want to highlight here is we're talking about thinking in general, but we've set ourselves up as scientists as okay, well, we do this theorizing and thinking, and then we watch people and they're biased and so forth. And I'm trying to create an equivalence in some sense to say that actually, here we have two bicycle mechanics who are engaging in the highest level of theory in some sense, right? They're engineers and they're proving scientists wrong, and they're finding and again, to get back to your point about prediction, they're not predicting per se, they're problem solving and doing, which is different, right? And prediction, like you mentioned, is inherently based on past data. And so we need some forward-looking mechanism to kind of bootstrap novelty and to see things in a different, in a different way. Einstein has this quote that I just absolutely love, and we can think about this in the context of Galileo or the Wright brothers, but he says, whether you can observe a thing or not depends on the theory which you use. It is the theory which decides what can be observed, right? And so it's not that the data lights up somehow and says, hey, I'm relevant, you should look at me. It's the theory that tells us kind of what to look for and what's important. And I think even, like I said, in our daily lives, what we have rattling in our head, what we're thinking about, starts to structure what becomes salient and important. And so I think that we are engaging in a quasi-scientific exercise in any interaction that we have kind of with the world, but it's not one where it's kind of world to mind, it's mind to world. And that, I think, is something that I don't know how you would program a point of view into a computer.
You talked about the idea that we don't need theory anymore. I've heard economists tell me this. They say, I don't like theories. I just listen to the data. And we've talked about this many times on the program. And you have to decide what data to listen to. There's a lot of it. And theory helps you do that. And of course, as Einstein was pointing out, and I think the other challenge, the other way to think about this is that forecasting is, as you said it a little better than I did, forecasting essentially is built on backcasting. You go back and you look at the past data and you build a model that fits that data. That's the backcast. You then go forward and you say, well, the forcing variables, the so-called independent variables, are going to be different in the future. And that allows me to predict, once I know what those are, I could set them in theory as levers of policy or behavioral manipulation. I will change those and then I know what I'm going to get. Because based on the backcast, I can now forecast what is going to happen. And of course, that often does not work. And the reason it doesn't work is fascinating. It's embedded, I think, in Hayek's Nobel Prize address, The Pretense of Knowledge, which we'll link to if you have not read it, listeners. It's a phenomenal article you can benefit from, even as a non-economist. It's not a technical article, but the point is that whatever I generated, whatever model I created out of the past data, it's based on a limited number of variables. And the future is going to, it's based, let me re-say that. The backcast is generated by looking at a limited number of variables and trying to tease out, using statistics, their relationship to one another. There are other things happening in the background I don't have data on, the other variables. And some of them are relevant, but I don't see them. I don't know which ones they are. And so when I forecast, I often go wrong because those unnoticed variables have changed. And as a result, my forecast does not match the quality of my backcast. My backcast might be extremely accurate. It's really good at fitting the data, fitting the model to the data I already have. But the model does a very poor job of forecasting what's going to happen in the future because there are other variables that I did not control for that are still oscillating and changing. And I think that underlying complexity of the world is what makes the world interesting and why algorithm-based pattern identification is often going to fail, whereas a human forecast of, quote, so-called irrational intuition can do fairly well. The puzzle and the challenge, I think, to your view is that, and I think this would be the common response, is that, oh, that's now. Oh, yeah, we don't have all the data, but give us enough time. Yes, maybe what I ate for breakfast in the morning will affect my purchasing behavior, or whether I got into an argument with my wife, or how much traffic I got into on the way to the grocery. But soon we'll have data on all that. The whole world will be mapped out and categorized and cataloged, and the models of the future will take all of that into account. And I come back to Nassim Nicholas Taleb's point, big data, bigger mistakes. That increase in data without a theory to help you decide what is irrelevant, not going to necessarily get you to better answers.
Right. I mean, in some ways, you're talking about backcasting and forecasting based on past data. I mean, in some ways, things do stay the same. And sometimes you can make predictions when things are roughly do stay the same over evolutionary time, for example. I was just thinking of the example. I've been working with evolutionary biologist Stuart Kaufman, and we've been wrestling with how is it that large evolutionary changes happen. And I'll just share a really quick example of this. And so it turns out that, over evolutionary time, early on, humans hunted by persistence hunting, which was simply we would run after animals. And eventually, because I'll take a deer, for example, deer can't sweat, they can't thermoregulate. We could catch a deer. Turns out that humans can catch a deer by persistence hunting by, over a 4-hour period. And it turns out that multiple different groups across the globe, this is how they hunted, right? And you can think about that as a simple evolutionary game where we know the variables. The variables are, it's my endurance versus the deer's sort of how fast they can run in the short term and whether they can kind of hide, right? And it turns out it was not a super stable thing. Like, there was, in some situations, you do this at the heat of day, humans would, just pass out and die as they're trying to catch the deer. But at some point, and there are these evolutionary transitions that kind of disrupt how we get calories, for example. But at some point, somebody said, we're chasing these deer. Our uncle just died last week because he, was sweating, and somebody says, well, why don't we just dig a large pit rather than run behind the deer? Why don't we just use the ground here? And so that's a variable that nobody thought about. For whatever reason, we thought the ground is great for running on and it's great for building things on. But what if we dig a large pit? And what if it's large enough where we don't just catch deer, we actually catch a mammoth or an elephant, right? And now all of a sudden you're getting way more calories, and you're not, you're passively hunting. And I think that there's something in humans where we have these simple models where we think we know the variables, but then somebody says, okay, well, no, let's think about this problem differently. We might actually solve some of our issues in terms of calorie expenditure by thinking about the problem in a different way. And we in a paper that we recently published, we highlight kind of evolutionary leaps or transitions like this. And a lot of people like Dennett and others say, well, things largely just stay the same, and then we somehow get lucky and something new emerges. But I think that there's actual problem solving going on the part of humans in terms of how to solve something like, something very fundamental like getting calories. And I think that's a theoretical, quasi-scientific, proto-scientific activity that we need to understand. And I don't know how that would get programmed. I mean, I think you can try to reverse engineer some of that and get it into computers and AI, but I think that that's still a unique capability that us as humans have that current systems don't.
Yeah, the fancy name for that is creativity. That's the jargon, sure. Right? Or innovation. Yeah. I think about this wonderful example. I don't know if it's true. It doesn't matter. Of if you put a dog on a leash, you tie the leash to a pole, and then you wrap the leash with the dog on it around another pole. Yeah. And the dog is, after the length of the leash is taken into account, the dog is now a foot away from the steak that it wants to eat, and the dog will bark and try to stretch the leash and try to get closer and closer to the meat. But the dog doesn't think of backing up and turning this right angle of the leash wrapped around the pole into a diagonal where then the dog can easily reach the meat. Whereas a squirrel supposedly can do this kind of thinking. And the clever part of this example is that squirrels live in trees. They have to live in 3 dimensions. Dog lives on the ground. They have to think in 2 dimensions. And then this is a sort of second, third, 2.5 dimension problem. I don't know what you would call it. But what's fun about it is that most of us are like the dog. When we're told, how do you get the meat? We think, well, try to get closer to it. And we stretch the leash and we might think, well, maybe the leash will break. We have certain forms of thinking that we would call inside the box. And the ability to think outside the box is what distinguishes the Wright brothers, or, my favorite example of this I've talked about before is Andrew Wiles solving Fermat's last theorem. After his first proof led him to great accolades in the front page of the New York Times, shortly afterwards it was discovered his proof had a mistake in it. He hadn't solved the problem of Fermat's last theorem, and his life spiraled downward into despair. And then you can watch this online. You can put a link up if we can find it. It's sometimes hard to find, but at some point he recounts that he just thought of a different way of thinking about it. He doesn't understand it. And when he tells the story, he's near tears, because it is one of the most beautiful and poignant examples of being a human being that were capable of these creative leaps. Very appropriate for this conversation. I was watching a video of Ray Bolger, who's the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz, singing on the Judy Garland show. And he rhymes deserve you, but with worthy of you. Now, they don't rhyme, but he sings it so that, someday I'd deserve you, I'd even be worthy of you, meaning of you. And that's why it's a genius song, and it's a beautiful song. And a computer would struggle to make that leap of creativity, but maybe it could someday. I'm not saying it can't. And I think the challenge, you can react to any of that you want, but I think the other challenge is those of us who are skeptical about the ability of AI to solve all human problems, we have to confront the fact that we said similar things in the last 10 and 20 and 30 years, and AI solved them all. I don't think it'll ever be as good as a human chess player. Oh, yes, it is. But not Go. Go is too complicated. Well, it did that easily. And now we're saying things, but it'll never write a great sonnet. Well, it writes some pretty good sonnets. Yeah, but not a really great, And so you're saying, and maybe you want to say more, but right now what I hear you saying is, okay, AI is pretty impressive, but what it won't do is come up with problems that are outside the box, solutions to problems that are outside the box. It won't think of a pit as a way to catch animals. It'll only want to try to think of catching them more effectively, run faster, start earlier in the morning when it's not as hot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Is that... There is a worry that in 10 years you're going to look like an idiot, Teppo. Maybe 10 months.
I'm a user of AI. I love these models. I think they're fantastic, but I still sort of am pulling for team human, I guess. And I think eventually it's going to be human and AI hybrids. And in the end, these models are building on human knowledge. It's all the text that we as humans have written, and it's people programming these models, these neural networks and transformer models and so forth. And so, at this stage, and there's been studies. Alison Gopnik, who's at Berkeley, a developmental psychologist, she looked at large language models versus 3 to 7 year olds and looked at how innovative are they. And her paper is fantastic. It just highlights how 3 to 7 year olds are more innovative in terms of how to think about tool use, for example. And she has many examples, and we can link to that. I think that there's something, and I think this contrast between kind of a digital intelligence and a biological one, I still think that there's something fundamentally different. Jeff Hinton says recently in several talks, who's one of the AI pioneers, says that digital intelligence beats biological intelligence, and I don't think that's the case. Like, I think biological intelligence has this propensity to kind of hypothesize, to theorize, and to problem solve in a way that's different. And we have now models of kind of causal AI that are trying to get at some of this logic. I'll add one other person to this. Judea Pearl he's a skeptic of kind of just correlational and associational approaches, and that's inherently what AI is. It's a correlational associational approach, whereas he says, we humans try to figure out some kind of causal logic for intervening in the world, for thinking counterfactually, right? And I think we can maybe prompt AIs around those types of things, but I still think that the human actor is important in terms of coming up with how to do that. And we're very much kind of forward looking, and again, AI is building on past data. And I think that so I don't look foolish in 10 years or 10 months from now or whatever it is. I think that the exciting things will be the hybrid AI and human solutions that generate new scientific insights. And there's lots of scientific disciplines where AI is fantastic. I'll just say on the poetry bit, I've talked to my daughter's getting a PhD in modern poetry at Oxford, and if you read the poems, if you read a person that's an expert in poetry, the poems that ChatGPT comes up with, an expert will not be impressed by it. And I'm sort of a fan of Emily Dickinson and Wallace Stevens, and I've tried to get it to say, generate sort of interesting poetry. And I have to say, I'm kind of skeptical. I've seen examples on Twitter or X and elsewhere of things, but I think it's sort of mediocre poetry. It's okay, but if you go to a Wallace Stevens or Emily Dickinson, you find just tremendous insight and ways of saying things. And again, the AI obviously can then build on that. You could sort of create a specialized large language model that's just trained with the corpus of a particular poet. And I've seen people generate like a Shakespeare generative AI to generate more Shakespeare plays, and so it can kind of riff off of that. But I do think that there's something there that humans are doing, and people like Judea Pearl and Alison Gopnik and others are getting at that. And in economic context, I'm very interested in how entrepreneurs and startups and managers do this, because I feel like this notion that AI is going to take over or should take over our decision making, I find that just far-fetched.
So I want to confess, I'm on your side. I want Team Human to do well, and I worry that some of my skepticism is just driven by that cognitive bias. Sure. I don't want to live in a world where we have nothing to contribute. That world doesn't seem like a pleasant world to live in. That's one reason. I do think it's at the heart of to defend the Team Human perspective intellectually rather than emotionally. Emotionally, I think it's totally fine to root for Team Human. It might be wrong, but sure. Intellectually, I think the case for Team Human is that we don't understand how Andrew Wiles solved Fermat's last theorem correctly in that second attempt. He doesn't understand it, and neither do we. We don't understand how Emily Dickinson wrote the poetry that she did. We don't understand. Beethoven, I think, claimed that it was easy. He wrote the note that came next. He just wrote it down. It was not hard. The note that was the right note. Right. And again, then that's a beautiful example of the sort of algorithm that large language models use, right? It looks for the next word using a stochastic process, right. And it's really amazing at it. But was that what Beethoven did with a smaller data set? No, he did something else. And how he did that, we don't understand. So I guess my level of defense of Team Human is that until we have a better understanding of how Team Human produces its greatest works. Another would be Michelangelo's David, which is supported by a little tiny stump on the ground, which was a fraction of the size that other sculptors were using. He was taking a 17-foot high piece of marble and supporting it with, kind of like the Wright Brothers, a scientifically unattractive stump to keep it from keeling over, and out of marble that he sculpted. If you look at the back, you'll see it there. It's holding it up in theory. We don't understand those things. We don't understand that process by which we come up with the pit instead of the race harder, train better, etc. If we understood that, I guess we'd be able to model it more effectively using perhaps non-biological machines as opposed to biological machines, which we are. So I don't know. That's where I'm at.
Yeah. No, I feel like the kind of the essence of what humans do is this. I like this quote by Søren Kierkegaard, who's a philosopher. He says that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And I think there's something human about looking to something else or having a belief about something. And again, these are the basis of irrationalities and things like that, but it's also the basis of progress and of new ways of seeing things. And I think that it's inherent and intrinsic to humans. And I think that, again, the AI art and things that are coming out, those are tremendous things. I think they're amazing tools, but I think that Team Human is always looking for new variables that we just haven't thought were very important before, and I don't think it's a computational process, that thinking. I think that there's something else that's going on, and that's I think the beauty of cognition and of human thinking.
Give me the Kierkegaard quote again.
Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards.
So we look back at our lives and we see certain things choices we made that led to certain outcomes. Some of them we were happier with than others. Some we might be outright unhappy with. So we start to understand something about how the world works through reflecting back on the past. It helps, that reflection, I believe, helps us lead a better life going forward, which is how we do have to live. We don't relive our lives and then tweak our decisions. History doesn't repeat itself. It only rhymes. And so when we come to a situation, an encounter with a certain type of person, and we think, oh yeah, when I dealt with that kind of person before, I did X, and that turned out to be a mistake. I won't do that again. And you can learn something from your past that tells you something about how to live in the future. But of course, those are things that are like that example I gave is an example of an encounter that's like one I had before. What do you do when you have one that's not like any that you had before? And one answer would be, of course, oh, it is like, you just don't realize it. And a machine would recognize it and realize that it's similar. But I do believe that fundamentally, and I have a book on this, Wild Problems, that many of our decisions that we make, it's not just a question of not having enough data. There's no amount of data that would tell you whether you're marrying the right person or whether you should have a child or a second child, or even what you should major in college or what career you should go into. You can have some information about it, but this romance that we have, almost religious, about the value of data and facts to make decisions seems to be fundamentally irrational. So that would be my claim.
Yeah. I mean, I think in some sense, once you have a belief or commitment, you start to create the facts. And that's part of the problem, is that there's this confirmation bias. So if you're picking a spouse, for example, you can make salient certain things that are good or bad, right? And so it's a commitment in some ways, right? And I think the same thing happens with a startup, right? They're sort of taking this leap, but then they're going out there and they're trying to sort of experiment and create the conditions under which they make it true. And again, it could be that it doesn't become true, right? And so, it could be that Airbnb doesn't become this large company worth whatever it is, $70 billion right now. But they, early on, they, different investors said that this basically isn't a business that is going to actually create value. And Fred Wilson famously invested in Instagram and Kickstarter, and lots of different businesses said this is just for couch surfers and hippies. But nonetheless, these founders, decided that, if we solve certain problems, we can create this reality. And actually, William James is, he's beautiful on this. He has this book, Will to Believe, as is James Peirce, around how we can create the conditions under which we find the facts and create those realities in a way that makes them true where they weren't previously so.
Did you mean Charles Peirce? Did you say James Peirce?
I said James Peirce, yeah. William James and Charles Peirce.
It reminds me of a story, which I think is actually true, probably told it before on this program, of Fred Smith. So Fred Smith famously writes supposedly a paper for a course where he outlines an idea for overnight delivery and famously gets a C when a C was a bad grade. Right. It's even worse grade now, of course, but It was still a bad grade then. So Fred ignores the grade, decides his professor doesn't understand. His professor is like the guy said only turkeys, 50 pounds is the cutoff. Right. So Fred Smith starts the company, and it fails. He can't. The first night he had 2 packages, and one of them was a birthday present to his mom. So he had 1 customer the first night, and weeks or months, I don't know how long, go by, and he can't make payroll. So he borrows more money. And then finally his bankers in Chicago say, no more. It doesn't work. All the data, we have lots of data. Right. It is not a viable project. And of course, the difference between a startup and a marriage is that whether a marriage has failed or not is a inherently non-objective, subjective assessment by at least one, if not both the parties. Sure. Whereas if you don't make your payroll, your business has failed. So he's not, but maybe not yet. I mean, maybe so far it has failed, but it could, in theory, recover. So Fred Smith has this will to believe. He rejects the data. He believes in the concept. He's full of cognitive bias, I am sure, by the way. He's overconfident beyond what any outsider would tell him. And I'm sure, I don't know if he's ever written about it, I'm sure all his friends and family said, including his sisters, who shared a trust fund with him, that he was wrong. He had made a mistake and he needed to shut this thing down. And he's got to fly back to Memphis to tell his staff that they haven't paid for a while and that's over. They need to go find another job. And instead of going back to Memphis, at the airport, he sees a sign for Reno, a flight going to Reno. He goes to Reno, goes to the blackjack table or the roulette wheel, I don't know what, takes his last remaining money, I think out of his sister's trust fund, their shared trust fund, and rolls the dice, literally and figuratively, and sustains the business for a little longer. Right. And it makes it. Doesn't just make it. It becomes an iconic transformation in how we think about delivery and the world. And so who was right? Was Fred right or wrong? That before it's like almost like Schlesinger's cat. FedEx is a failure and a success. It turned out because of his irrationality, he was able to generate the data that proved it worked. Right. But no one else believed in it. He was insane. He was literally an insane, crazy man, not rational. And yet he was much smarter than anyone else. At least that one. Many other companies have had a similar insane founder who lost all the money. It did fail. Absolutely. Yeah. Right.
I think luck can definitely play a role. I think, I don't know if it's Napoleon or somebody like that, but it has this quote that luck favors the prepared mind. And so there's still something that, Fred Smith needs to do to kind of figure out the problems that he had with the business, right? And so how do you develop this kind of underlying causal logic of how it is that we quickly get packages to their destinations? And clearly that was a problem he was able to, or a set of problems that he kind of compiled and pulled together as sort of an architect and was able to create value. But yeah, luck also plays a role in these types of situations, but I do think that humans have an ability to think about those underlying causal logics of how it is that we can solve certain problems that will enable them to, in this case, create economic value.
Well, the crazy part about Fred Smith and Vernon Smith, no relation as far as I know, pointed this out, I think, on an EconTalk ages ago. The value of the hub system
Right.
is a genius idea, which looks like stupidity. So if you're flying a package from San Francisco to Oakland, you fly to Memphis and then it changes planes and then it goes out to Oakland. And that seems remarkably inefficient and stupid. It's a genius idea because it means you have to have many, many fewer planes in the air at night. I mean, it's such a clever idea. It's the equivalent, not to insult Fred Smith, it's the equivalent of figuring out that if you dig a big hole in the ground, right, you're going to maybe be a more effective hunter.
Exactly.
Right? It's so outside the box.
Right.
And I'd love to know how he came up with that. If he if he saw an analogy somewhere or saw something that made him think of it, or whether it's just a flash of what we call a flash of insight.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I mean, just to turn that on its head, I mean, when Southwest Airlines started, most airlines had a hub and spoke system by then. And when investors were looking at Southwest Airlines, they said, well, you're flying point to point. That makes no sense. Like, we know that the best model is a hub and spoke system. And so they were systematically, there's good research on this, they were systematically undervalued for a long time for investment analysts who said, this is not how we do things. But they said, no, we have a system, we have a causal logic for having why we're serving these underserved markets where, we don't have to pay as high airport fees because we're flying from Lubbock to, wherever it is in Missouri. And so that they upended and sort of offered a contrarian belief and model for the world in that setting, which ended up creating tremendous amounts of value, but it was contrarian at the time. Again, they were undervalued systematically. And so I think that is what humans do. Like, the data says, no, all airlines use this hub and spoke system. They say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do things differently. And I think that's at the heart of what humans do, but the heart of, kind of economic value creation and strategy is uniqueness and difference.
So the lesson of today's episode, dear listeners, is it's easy to be successful. Just think of things that no one else has thought of. That work.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's something that, I'm involved in studies where we're trying to elicit this from entrepreneurs and startups. And so I think there's things that we can do. I mean, I think different or be creative. Those are sort of shorthand for an underlying process for how it is that you carefully think about, how to be contrarian and different in the midst of everybody else thinking a certain way. And so I think that there's ways of eliciting that out of people. And that's certainly what I thought, what we thought when I was in venture capital, is that there's ways in which we can influence these entrepreneurs for thinking about their context in a different way and coming up with contrarian beliefs that enable them to create value in ways that others just didn't envision. And so I do think that there's things that can be done there. But yes, think different sort of summarizes that. So,
and we'll close with this. I think what's so hard about being a thoughtful human being is that it's so easy, because of our cognitive biases, no doubt, or evolutionary inheritance. It's so easy to do what everyone else does. It's so easy to do what we've always been doing because it usually works. And the idea, finding ways to be reflective and to think deeply about why the patterns of living and choices that you've developed for yourself might not be the best way to live, is really, really hard. And for me, to the extent that I've found ways to do that, it's not through systematic thinking about it. This is the irony of this conversation for me. I think to the extent I have found ways to think outside the box, I think they're the result mostly of experience, which is basically the accumulation of data that my non-conscious mind works on without my help. Creativity is, it's really hard to teach. But I think the point I'm trying to make, I'm not saying it very well, it's really hard to break out of one's own habits of mind and thought and to stop and to reflect. Life is so hard. It's moving so quickly.
Yeah.
One analogy would be, the idea that you're going to just head the bus in a different direction when all you're trying to do is to change the tire while, repair the flat while the bus is moving. That's most of what we're doing. Just keep the bus going. It's really hard. And taking the time to think about different ways to behave and make decisions is just really hard, seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm at a university. I've been at universities for several decades, and I teach science. I teach things that most people believe, like we're all teaching the same things that are established facts in some sense, right? But what I'd like to teach is sort of a higher level that says, okay, these established facts are constantly evolving, and at some point, somebody said, "I'm going to think about this differently," and that's not very. Knowledge is kind of justified belief. It's justified by evidence. But what we ought to also teach is this idea of, okay, there's beliefs that are kind of ahead of their time potentially. And that can lead to all kinds of delusions and confirmation and bias and so forth. But it can also lead to novel ways of seeing things, like with Galileo, or novel technologies like with the Wright Brothers. And so I think that any mechanisms that we can incorporate into our teaching and how to think to our students and more generally as human beings, to incorporate that kind of meta level of being critical and so forth, I think are useful and important. So,
my guest today has been Teppo Felin. Teppo, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Great, thanks for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.